Katherine McLaughlin is going to be presenting on consent in people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And go ahead and take it away, Katherine.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a good day and enjoying the conference so far. So as Anna said, I am Katherine McLaughlin, and I am a sexuality educator and trainer, and I have been for over 25 years, and my focus has been on people with developmental intellectual disabilities. When I first started this work, there weren't a lot of resources available. I was working for Planned Parenthood in northern New England, and started working with Green Mountain Self-Advocates in Vermont. I'm actually located in New Hampshire. And I did what I probably many of you can relate to. I did what most educators do when I get a request. I figured I'll create some lessons and I'll teach them, and I'll do what I normally do. And the self-advocates were like, no, I don't think so. We want to be part of creating it. Nothing about us without us, which is one of the self-advocacy sayings. And also we want to teach it as well. We don't want to just, help design it, but we want to be one of the instructors. So I created this curriculum with Green Mountain Self-Advocates, and it's designed for someone with a developmental disability and a professional to team teach the curriculum. So a lot of my work has been working with people with disabilities in creating materials that make sense for them, work for them, use the language that's important to them. So like I said, I've been doing this work for a while, and then about 3 years ago, I started Elevatus Training. I had been doing these trainings on the side and had other jobs, and then just kept getting requests. So I started Elevatus Training, and the idea behind it is, I've spent my life trying to elevate the status of people with disabilities and to have them being seen as sexual beings. And so that's where we came up with the name Elevatus Training. So I have a presentation here on consent and people with developmental disabilities, but I also wanted to make sure that you feel that you can ask questions as we go through the material. And before we start, I believe there's a poll we're going to do. Do I have that right? I don't know if it's Anna or host. I believe there was a poll we were going to do.
I didn't prepare a poll, but it might be that Gabriella has it.
Yeah, I was not notified that we had a poll.
That's fine.
I can.
Not a big deal. No, it's fine.
Try here. I can add it.
Nope, that's okay.
Okay.
No, what I really wanted to just get a sense of people's experience working with this population. So I don't know if you all work in this with people with developmental disabilities and want to learn about consent, or if you work in sort of the violence prevention world and you want to learn about people with disabilities. So if you could just put in the chat, sort of how you would say your level of experience of working with this population is. Do you work with them on a daily basis? Have you never worked with them? Have you a few times? Sort of just give me a sense so that I know who's here and what areas to really focus on. If you add that to the chat, and just so you know, I forgot my charger at home. So somebody ran to their house and got me the charger. So I am just plugging it in, and I'm going to jump up in a couple minutes to plug in the other part, but so far we're good. All right, so let me just see what we've got, just kind of to get a sense of who's here. Looking for experience with this community. Okay, great. No, I don't usually work with this population. Okay, a few times, great. Yep. Okay, great. All right, so I'll just get started, and it kind of gives me a sense. And for the most part, what I've heard so far is little or minimal experience with this population, or maybe you're working with the population but aren't necessarily aware of it. Okay, great. So consent in people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I'm just gonna go through these slides, and you can put questions in the chat, and I believe someone's going to be monitoring the chat. And so if it feels like it's the right time to interrupt, feel free to interrupt me, whoever's monitoring the chat, and then I can answer it, or I'll leave plenty of time at the end for us to talk about any concerns, questions you have. So in my work with people with developmental disabilities, I asked them, why do they want and need sexuality education? And this was their responses. So we can learn to have healthy relationships, so we aren't lonely. And loneliness is a big issue for people with developmental disabilities, because they don't have necessarily the opportunity to practice social skills. And they maybe aren't taught anything about how you interact and form relationships. So there can be a lot of loneliness. So we're able to make informed choices, which is probably what most of us are focused on, is that as prevention educators. So we can pick the right person for help with the toughest part of the relationship, making it last, so we can be safe, because we all have desires and needs, and that's okay, so that people know their rights, so that we can be sexual self-advocates and not just self-advocates. And many self-advocates say that there's this whole movement around being in charge of your life, making decisions, doing what you want, those kinds of things. But when it comes to sexuality or dating or privacy or anything along those lines, they get a different kind of response than they do if they ask about or state that they'd like to live on their own, or they state that they'd like to get a job. And when they ask those things, people say, okay, let's come up with some goals, and we'll get you there. Where with dating, sexuality, there's more of this sort of awkward silence. So they feel like sexuality education would help them be stronger sexual self-advocates. And they also, Green Mountain self-advocates, they defined what does sexual self-advocacy mean to them. And there's a big pamphlet, with lots of different ideas, but just to summarize, speaking up for yourself sexually, getting information, so learning about sexuality and relationships, taking a stand, saying to whomever, this is my choice, stating your sexual limits and desires with your partner, respecting others' limits and desires, and starting to do what you want with relationships. So I think with the general population, we assume that most people will be in some sort of sexual and or romantic relationship in the future. Maybe not everyone, but we kind of assume that that will happen at some point. For people with disabilities, sort of the exact opposite is what's assumed, right? That they won't be in a relationship. So in order to be a sexual self-advocate, it's twofold. They have to speak up for their desire and right to have a relationship, as well as learning the skills for when you're in a relationship, speaking up for yourself. Where the general population may not have to do so much around the right as people with disabilities do. So for the workshop, we're going to talk about why people with intellectual developmental disabilities are at risk of sexual violence. We're going to review some tips for working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and then explore strategies for teaching consent to this population. And I know that many of you prevention educators are already teaching consent, so you might just have to tweak some of what you're already doing based on some of the tips that I'm going to review. So just a general question, if you could answer in the chat as well. It's, as we all know, it's never the person who's abused fault that this has happened, but why do you think people with intellectual and developmental disabilities might be more at risk? The statistics are much higher, 7 times more likely to be sexually abused than the general population. And for women with intellectual and developmental disabilities, 12 times more likely than the general population. So what's your thinking about why these statistics are so high? So you can put your answers in the chat. Just a few would be great to see kind of what's on your mind and what you're thinking. Possible physical barriers as well as communication, emotional barriers. Yeah. So lots of barriers. Any other thoughts about it? They're given less access to sexual health, consent, education. Absolutely. So it might be hard to identify a situation, unable to articulate abuse, so abusers know they will not be reported. Absolutely. Feel like there's not nearly enough supports for individuals with disabilities, so they're left to try to puzzle through consent on their own. Yeah, absolutely. Power dynamics. Yeah, and I think for many people with developmental disabilities, they feel submissive or subordinate in general with many people. And so that power dynamic, even if there isn't power there, the power could be given as well. So thank you. Barriers to reporting, absolutely. Less likely to be believed as well when they do report. Less thought of as less credible. Okay, so I'm just going to go through some of the sort of negative messages in our culture that you might find helpful in sort of thinking about the work you're doing and how you might think some of this through. And great other examples, cultural myths as asexual, exactly what I'm about to talk about, might be able to manipulate, they might look less competent. Yeah. Okay, so yes, definitely the message is that they're asexual, right? So they don't have any desires, needs, or anything like that. So these beliefs, like this person said, about people with disabilities. There's also a belief that they're hypersexual as well. So we're going to withhold information to try to control their hypersexual behavior. And what that usually comes from is maybe lack of information about public and private, or lack of control of their lives. And so they have no privacy at home. So therefore they might have sex in the bushes at the park, and then they're arrested, and people think that they're hypersexual, like they couldn't even wait till they got home or something, when really it's more about not having privacy to do what lots of people do, but in a private place. And also thought of as childlike too. And many times you'll hear, and maybe you even think this, that you focus on the cognitive age. I don't like using that term, but you might hear that. A parent or a staff person might say, yeah, they are 21, but they have a cognitive age of 5. And so that's really not relevant. What's relevant is the biological age. And every 21-year-old needs the same information, no matter whether they have a disability or not. How you teach it might be a little different because of someone's cognitive ability or, limitations or capabilities, but not what you teach. There's lots of stereotypes too around being dependent and not being able to make good decisions. So sort of some of those beliefs also influence how people interact and approach people with developmental disabilities. And then just sort of the general ableism, right? This, that people with disabilities are less than people without disabilities. So all of these negative cultural messages kind of lead to lack of sexuality education that someone mentioned in the chat, complying versus consenting. And this population is often taught to comply and to not necessarily consent, and so they start to learn to be pleasing to other people, which we know is a risk factor, right? If you're always trying to please someone versus doing what's right for you. They can often feel disempowered by many of these messages and lack of information. There's also a lack of body autonomy, which is similar to that complying piece. When I work with people with developmental disabilities, I do this name tag game with them where they can put their name tag on the right or left so that we can see their name. And the message is, it's your body and you get to decide what's right for you. And then each week when I'm with them, I add a different kind of pressure to that. And I have to constantly reinforce that it's their body and they get to decide what's right for them. So when we're thinking about consent, I mean, if you don't even believe that your body is your own and you have the right to make decisions about it, how can you even say yes or no? So body autonomy is a big piece here too. And then just plain old lack of control of their lives, all of these negative messages and stereotypes and ableism. And then much higher rate of sexual violence, as I mentioned before, unplanned pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, and loneliness and isolation as well. And one thing too that I think you might all be really interested in a way, is sometimes also people with disabilities are more likely to be thought of as perpetrators, when in fact it's really more of a lack of education as well. So let's just say a man who is autistic is attracted to someone and follows them around, right? That person's fearful and scared, and rightly so. What a scary thing that someone's following you around. Because oftentimes they're not taught, like, how do you actually court someone? And that actually what you're doing could be scary to someone. So I work with a lot of young men who have, there's just this belief about them that they're perpetrators, when lots of times it's because, I'm not saying there aren't ever, it's because they don't have the information to understand and make decisions that don't scare people and also meet their needs. So just the disability and self-advocacy movements give positive messages, and these positive messages have a much better impact, right? So empowers self-advocates, to feel like they can make their decisions and get information and about anything, not just sexuality. Person-centered, so it's focused on the person and versus the staff person-centered. Or there's also a move towards supported decision-making. So for many people, you may have heard they may have guardians that can make some decisions for them in their lives. Sometimes they're family members, sometimes they're a public guardian. But really the movement is away from that and have it be more supported decision-making versus guardianship, because there's less control, you have less control over your life when you have a guardian. And there's also this sort of movement in the culture to, the schools say to parents, you're going to lose your right to make decisions for your child when they turn 18, get guardianship. And so there's a lot of work in the disability field around not getting guardianship, but supported decision making. Another piece of the disability movement is sort of this dignity of risk, that, we can be overly protective of people with disabilities because we know they're at risk, right? But also we want to make sure people have the dignity to make risks, just take risks like we all do. And many people with disabilities will say, to their parents, will you just let me make a mistake, please? Where there's just a lot of overprotection because of vulnerability and maybe lack of education. But people with disabilities are saying, let me make a mistake, let me learn from it, versus trying to make everything perfect and okay so I never get hurt or never make any mistakes. Sexuality and relationships are human rights, which is part of the messaging that we get from the disability and self-advocacy movement. And this idea that everyone deserves sexuality education is another part of those movements. So as you can, imagine, these more positive messages versus our cultural message, these are more disability-focused messages. There's more likely that individuals are going to feel like they own their bodies and their lives and their minds, that they have control of their lives, that they're making their own decisions, that they're proud of who they are, that they have dignity, and that dignity of risk and dignity around being a human, and they're forming positive, healthy relationships. And then we find that there's less abuse too. And this, and that sexuality education is important as well to decrease abuse. So what I'm hoping is you can think about some of the disability movement, some of the self-advocacy movement messages in your work around people with disabilities. So I'm going to talk about some of the sort of tips and things to think about when you are doing prevention work and you want to reach this population and make it more cognitively accessible, more inclusive. So I kind of have like 3 steps here. And first is just a self-reflection, which is all good for all prevention educators and sexuality educators. But really thinking through some of those beliefs that I kind of went through, the cultural beliefs. And it's okay that you have those, like they're in the culture. And so it's just being kind of aware. Do I have any negative, positive values, attitudes, beliefs regarding sexuality and disability? Did I think, you know, before coming to this workshop or before I met someone that wanted to be in a relationship and had a disability, had I thought maybe they didn't want to? So really thinking through, like, did I have any of those negative, or have I always been really like positive and I've gotten it on a different level? Am I comfortable or uncomfortable with people with disabilities? Why or why not? And my experience is that we're more comfortable with exposure, right? If they are over there, there's just this unknown that makes us kind of uncomfortable. And I think also with the disability movement, there's a lot of discomfort around, I don't know how to interact. Do I hold the door? Do I not? Do I, you know, how do I do this to not be offensive too? So I think there's lack of exposure and then just a fear of not doing it right too. And that kind of moves to the next one. Am I nervous about doing something wrong or see them as fragile in some way? So those are just questions to ask yourself. And then what kind of experience do I have working with this population? And most of you who put in the chat, it was minimal or none. So that's going to make it more difficult, right? But the more we have, the more experience and exposure, and the more comfortable we get with anything that might be different than ourselves. And then since there's a higher rate of abuse, you're going to hear many abuse stories. And have you or I done the work of my own trauma history to be able to hear some of these things when you're teaching this population? It's, you know, the statistics are just so high that you're definitely going to have, you're probably going to hear more about it when you're teaching this population than you do the general population. Even if the general population has a history, the rates aren't as high. So am I okay in my own trauma history if I have a history of trauma to work with this population? And I've had people at my trainings come to me and say, you know what, I'm not ready to do this work because I have a trauma history and I'm just not at a place where I'm feeling that I've healed from it, and I'm just not ready to do that. And that's all right too. So these are just things for self-reflection and thinking things through. And then we also have to think about, well, what are some of the needs of the participants? If you're a prevention educator and you're going to be teaching a group of people with developmental disabilities, what are some of the needs that they might have? So just first off, thinking about, well, what sexuality education have they received, if any? And I'm telling you, I have done many programs where 50-year-olds don't know how babies are made for people with developmental disabilities. So lack of basic sexuality education is often not there, which means you're going to have to start kind of over or start at the beginning. Some people that you might be working with are non-speaking as well. Sometimes people will say nonverbal, so they're not speaking. So that's a much harder piece to work on, right? How do you communicate if someone's not speaking? And how are people who are non-speaking engaged in the content when all they can do is thumbs up, thumbs down, right? So you really don't have a sense of what they're learning. And the curriculum that I wrote with Green Mountain Self-Advocates, we just designed some communication boards and cards, which you can use. They go with the curriculum. So if you find that you have someone who's non-speaking that you might be teaching, it'd be a great resource. So you ask certain questions and they point, or they use their eyes to look at the answer. It helps you really assess what they're getting from the class as well. And I'm not sure that there's people in my classes sometimes that are speaking, and it would be really helpful to understand what they're comprehending or not comprehending too. So you could use it in lots of different ways. Non-reading would be another one that I don't know the statistics, but chances are people in your class will be non-readers. And so you want to ask for volunteers to read something, but not assuming everyone can. You can ask for volunteers, but also making sure that you read it as well. So if you do, some kind of activity that that's up on the board or on the PowerPoint, or that you read it as well, so that those who don't read can understand it. The communication boards and cards that we're using too, we tried to put graphics on all of them as well, so that non-readers could point to things based on the visual on the card versus the word, the text. Do they need movement? Sometimes people with autism need to get up and move around a lot. And so is that something that you might see in the classroom, and that you might set a group agreement that it's okay if you need to get up and sit somewhere else or move around a little bit, it's fine. Is there also a physical disability, which might mean that you'd have to talk a little bit more about sexuality and physical disabilities as well? Is the person deaf? Do they need American Sign Language interpreter for part of it? Are there sensory issues? So people with sensory issues might have either they're craving sensory senses, or don't want any kind of, and somewhere in between, of course, or avoid senses, and because it can be overstimulating. And do they need more time to process the content? Now, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities will probably need more time, but then there might be people that need even more time. And sometimes with this group where they need a lot of time to process, I will do some pre-teaching or give some of the materials to someone that's supporting them ahead of time. And then they will work, give them a little bit ahead, then they come to class and they're part of the class, and then post-teaching, because a lot of repetition is really helpful with this population too. So I think really trying to understand what your group is like. And I've often done, if you do work like a 4-session kind of series, I often really go to the first one as a way to get to know the group and what are some of their learning needs. And some of the things that make groups easier is if people have similar learning styles or needs. If you have a wide range of abilities and limitations, it's really hard to teach, which, I'm sure you're aware of that, but I'm in a class, and sometimes it can feel like there's 2 groups there. One group is talking away and discussing things and want to take it down a certain path. And I'm in that moment thinking, if I go there, I'm going to lose half the group. So there's a lot of that kind of juggling and thinking through what's the best thing to do in the moment. So the more you have people with similar abilities and limitations, the less you have to do that kind of thinking about things. So that's something to consider. And I've often described working with this population as like so much fun and so energizing and positive, and they're so appreciative that you're getting this information and being treated with respect. But it's also can be the most exhausting as well, because there's so many different learning needs, and you've got a lot going on in your brain around trying to reach everyone. And you can oftentimes feel as if you're not reaching everyone. All right, so that's a little bit, okay, a little bit on, you're about to go into the classroom or the group setting. And then here are just some techniques to consider when you're teaching this population. And you really want to slow down. And especially when things are online, right? I mean, we all kind of feel like you have to slow down online. And silence is okay. Just give it time. Someone will speak up. And if people need more time to process, then that means they need more time to process the question and think it through. So slow down. Be concrete. And so the difference between, oh, I'll actually go through that in a little bit, the difference between concrete and abstract. So you want to be as concrete as possible. And we want to use something that is called plain language. So it's sort of language that probably won't be misunderstood, and it's sort of simplified in a way. And you want to take breaks, short chunks of content, and avoid ambiguity. Or if there is ambiguity, you want to state it too. So many people with developmental disabilities like things to be black and white and really struggle with the gray. And so sometimes you can talk about black and white, and then what are the few areas where things are gray? So for example, we might say something like, when you know, the only person that should be touching your sexual parts is yourself in a private place, or a doctor that's making sure you're healthy, or a care provider if you need help bathing or diapering, or someone that you've decided you want to be sexual with. And so rather than, you know, really like, you know, no one should touch your sexual parts. And I know all of you know a lot of this, but really laying it all out too, so that it's clear about when something's okay or not okay. Group agreements, I'm going to talk about these. I think what's important in our classes is to help people with disabilities act like other people their age. Right? And I don't mean like act your age in sort of a shaming kind of way, but what I mean is creating like boundaries around who you talk about what with. And so that versus like you're in a class and you share all these sexual stories. So I'll talk about some of those group agreements where I try to keep some sort of healthy boundaries around what's expressed in the class as well. And then rather than saying, does that make sense? Not does not make sense. Rather than saying, does that make sense? Which is something I often say to lots of people, like, does that make sense? You want to say something more like, can you repeat what we just talked about? Tell me what you learned from that. Because again, if somebody's taught to be pleasing and I say, does that make sense? They say yes, even though it doesn't make sense. So we want to try to assess that it made sense by asking them to repeat it, or maybe using a communication board to point at things. And as I mentioned earlier, be prepared for disclosure. And I think doing the general things that we all do when someone discloses around it not being somebody's fault, and then providing trauma-informed sexuality education as well. And then also knowing the difference between person-first language and identity-first language. So person-first is really what is recommended around referring to people with disabilities. And the reason it came about was people were often referred to as the blind or the deaf or wheelchair bound. So it was all about their disability versus them being a person. And so person-first language started so that we'd say a person who uses a wheelchair, you know, just like, hello, they're a person, you know, a person who's hard of hearing. So that was kind of the trend for many, many years. And then probably in the last few years, there's been more of a preference to use identity first language, like in particular in the autism community. people will refer to themselves as autistic. And I think it's very similar if we think about it to, LGBTQ, that people don't say I'm a person who's a lesbian, right? You usually say I'm a lesbian, or right. So it's identity first versus person first. So my recommendation is to use person first, unless you hear someone identify themselves that way and, as like autistic, and then you can use that. But I know it's similar to, pronoun use, right? And finding out how people want to be referred to. It's sort of the same thing around language too. Okay, great. Yeah, so somebody said, acknowledging this in the autism community. Yeah, we always ask how they identify, preferences if possible. Exactly. How do you like to be identified? As a person with a disability, or autistic, or a person with autism? Right, excellent. A variety of disabilities, which I've talked about before, and that we have to provide some adaptations, communication supports, interpreters, technology, possibly do lots of role playing and hands-on visuals. One thing we want to do is assume competence, because oftentimes, sort of like innocent until proven guilty, guilty until proven innocent. Oftentimes with people with disabilities, we assume incompetence first, and then they have to prove to us that they're competent. And we really want to switch that around. Assume competence first. And then if something is demonstrated that maybe they don't have the competence to do this or that. But starting from that, you're innocent until proven guilty. You're competent until proven incompetent. And then I also talked about the act your age, and that we really want to think about, what's my expectation of a 21-year-old without a disability? And I want to teach some of those skills and ways of being, so that they're not 21 and sitting on somebody's, uncle's lap, right? I mean, that's just not how 21-year-olds act. So we want to teach, how does a 21-year-old act, whether you have a disability or not? I think also sometimes communication, people might not be able to communicate in a clear way. And it's important to, if you don't understand, to try not to pretend that you do understand as well, and tell them that you didn't understand and ask them to repeat. We want to give messages from the self-advocacy movement and other disability movements, like I mentioned before, and then just general messages about sexuality, positive messages, meeting them where they are instead of making assumptions. Exactly. Yes, yes, yes. Treat people with intellectual developmental disabilities just like everyone else. And know that with patience, you'll get more and more confident working with this population. And it's really important work too, much needed. So I'm just going to share a few more tips and around working with this population, and you can think about the work you're doing and how you might apply some of this. So I call my class rules group agreements. Some people call them ground rules, right? I'm assuming you have lots of these kinds of things. So I think keeping it confidential and really being clear about that, which I'm assuming many of you do in this line of work. And so I say, I'm going to keep it confidential unless you're being hurt or you're hurting someone else or damaging someone's property. Show respect for everyone's opinion. I think that's one that's important for all of us. Express your feelings in a kind way. So I'll have people that maybe they're feeling anxious about the class and they might say, ooh, gross, and they really don't really mean that. They're just uncomfortable. So I often will talk about, let's just say you're at a party and you go up to the table and there's chips and dip on the table, and you take a chip. This is before COVID, of course, when we actually socialized. And you take a chip and you scoop up the dip and you put it in your mouth and you realize that you actually don't like the taste at all. you could say, oh my God, this is disgusting. Who made this, right? I mean, and that would obviously hurt the person who made it. So when sort of that don't yuck my yum kind of thing as a group agreement, but really spelling out what I mean. But if you were to have the dip and someone says, how's the dip? And you want to express yourself, you can express yourself in a kind way and say, I didn't really care for the dip, and put it in a napkin and throw it away, rather than, oh my God, right? So we can express ourselves and not hurt others as well. Okay, so I'm just going to read in here. As a parent of a child with IDD, I can't thank you enough for being such a great advocate. Oh, thank you. You're welcome. People with IDD are so incredibly vulnerable and underserved. Yes, yes, yes. So the more comfortable all of us can be in serving this population, that's really going to help. It's very vulnerable because of lack of information and just, you know, the nature of the disability. I also really like to have something around, it's okay to ask questions and important to ask questions in class, just not personal, private questions. So it's okay to say, how do I ask someone out on a date? But it's not okay to ask someone if they had sex last night. That is private. So I do a lot of work with different types of relationships and what's okay to talk about with each of these relationships, because when we don't know those skills, or it's often very subtle things, and because of the nature of one's disability, it's hard to pick up on those cues about what's okay and not okay. And so we have to really spell it out. Like this, when you're in class, you're with casual friends, acquaintances, and we only talk about public things with acquaintances and group members. And you can talk about private things like your body and, you know, private sexual stories with someone that you're really close with, like a family member that you trust and are really close to, maybe a doctor if you have questions about your body or things like that, and maybe a partner, a sweetheart when you have a partner. And all those things have to be done. When you talk about private things, it's done in a private place. But again, when we talk about gray area, so here I am talking about sexual parts in a public place because we're in class. So that's one of those gray areas where it's okay because we're learning, but we are going to shut the door so that people walking down the hall aren't going to hear these private things. But it wouldn't be okay to go to the grocery store and talk to people about these topics because they're strangers or acquaintances, and we don't talk about private things with them. So it's one of those kind of, you know, gray areas that we want to explicitly declare. And I will often say too, it's okay to share stories, but not personal sexual stories, because those are private. Now, it's tricky because we don't want people to feel ashamed of their stories. But what I usually say is, you know, we don't share personal sexual stories in class. If you need to talk to me after class about something really private, let's do that. I'll be here after class. So I think that's an important piece around just, again, it's that vulnerability. If you're sharing sexual stories with people you barely know, you appear more vulnerable, and you are more vulnerable as well. So we want to sort of make those distinctions. I'm going to just do a few more slides and make sure we have time for questions. I talked about language, and I would also talk about sometimes people will use higher functioning and lower functioning. And I understand why people use it. They're trying to give me a picture of the person's abilities and limitations. But many self-advocates don't like that kind of terminology because they feel like if you say I'm higher functioning, then that means I'm higher functioning in everything. And so I'm not really, I feel like you don't even acknowledge my disability, because I do have struggles in this area, but I don't have struggles in this area. And also people who said that they're thought of as low functioning feel like, well, maybe I am in this area, but I'm not in this area. So just those labels, you know, how they can be. But I think sort of the terms now that people are using are low support needs. So someone that doesn't need a lot of extra help in class, right? So they're low support. Or they have high support needs and they need more. So you're sort of describing their strengths and limitations. Like this person is very strong in the area of communicating verbally, but they have trouble reading, right? So you're describing them and how they learn versus labeling them. So we want to give positive messages about sexuality, but we also, one of the things that happens with this population is because of the vulnerability around abuse, people focus on preventing abuse rather than that sort of more positive focus of healthy sexuality, which is part of preventing abuse, but to not just be so focused on abuse prevention. Give consistent messages. The more that people get that consistent message, the more effective the teaching is, and do lots and lots of repetition. We talked about biological age, not cognitive age, when we're looking at topics. And then some people need more topics, like what is public, what is private, what are the different kinds of relationships? So sometimes it's different topics than what we generally teach. So it's making sure we're meeting those needs around what they need to learn. They really need a curriculum that meets their needs versus just making adaptations. So, you know, I would recommend getting a curriculum for this population. But if you don't want to do that, you can adapt. I just want to be sure some of the adaptations that I've seen, I don't feel like come from the disability movement sort of focus. So if you are looking at adaptations, maybe looking to make adaptations, maybe working with a couple people with disabilities around making those adaptations. So they've got that lens and lived experience of having a disability brought into the tweaks and adaptations you're making. Whoops. And I keep moving this around. I think I've talked about that. I've talked about group agreements. I do want to talk about physical, social, and emotional, because I think this would be really helpful in some of the work that you're doing. So it's called the Scarborough method, which is used for people with developmental disabilities in teaching. And so we want, one thing that's important and helps with that repetition is to not only just answer the question, like what are the physical aspects of the question that you were just asked, but also what are the social aspects and what are the emotional aspects. So for example, you know, social aspects are going to be things about privacy. So when you're talking about sexuality, relationships, consent, all of these topics, you want to make sure that you talk about privacy and what that means. And so we want to focus on social aspects. And then responsibility, laws, another one. So this is illegal, this is legal. And then emotional can be, you know, what are the feelings that are connected to it as well? And they can be positive feelings or they can be negative feelings. And the reason that we want to bring in feelings is that sometimes people with developmental disabilities struggle with the feelings part and understanding feelings and identifying feelings. So we're helping people identify feelings when we attach feelings to our answers. So here's just a, you know, example of like someone says to you, what is a condom? So we're going to say something like, it's a rubber sock that is shaped, it's rubber that's shaped like a sock and it covers a penis. Using a condom is private, something that you do in private. It protects you and your partner. And then emotional, many people feel good when they use them because they're being responsible and don't have to worry. So we're giving a little more than just what is a condom. We're giving some of the social aspects around it as well as some of the emotional aspects. Another one might be something like, I usually use the example of what is a boner and having to answer that. So we're going to say something like, it's when the penis gets hard and sticks out from the body. It's something that needs to happen in private. It can feel good when it happens in private. If it happens in public, sometimes people can feel really embarrassed. So you want to go to a private place if it happens, or Find out how to hide it when you're in public, because it can make you feel uncomfortable and others uncomfortable, because it's something that happens, that should happen in private or needs to happen in private. So that, so that's kind of combining all of those things. I'm going to do a couple more. It looks like I've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to leave a little bit of time for questions, unless people want to start putting some questions in now. But I want to make this point about concrete versus abstract. So concrete is specific, it's step by step, it's detailed and simplified. Abstract is too general. So for example, someone with a developmental disability was said that you need to masturbate in private. Private is when no one is around. And so he went to McDonald's at 3 in the afternoon and sat in the dining area and no one was around and started masturbating. Right? So we have to be, that's more abstract. No one is around. So we want to really break it down. So an example is, how do you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? You take each sort of step when we're thinking about things being concrete. So not just you take 2 pieces of bread, you put the peanut butter on, you jelly, you put it together. You want to be like, you open the refrigerator, you take your bread out. That's where you keep your bread. You get the peanut butter from the shelf. You get so much more detailed. So an example of public and private. So public is when other people are there or might be there. So people, it's where people go in and out. There's certain ways of speaking and touch that are okay to do in public, but not all. Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat are all public. Private is where you're alone and no one can come in and out. Your bedroom or home bathroom with the door closed is private. There's certain way of speaking and touch that are okay to do in private, but not in public. So you can see how concrete that is. So you can show a picture of a bus and one person sitting in the way back and there's a bus driver, and is this public or private? And they might say, well, the bus driver can't really see me, so isn't it private? Nope, because people can come in and out and there is somebody there as well. So we want to, break it down. Can people come in and out? And I often will use public restrooms. I call them public. Even if it's a single stall, it's still a public restroom that lots of people are supposed to be using versus the one at home. And then I've got a little bit here on consent, and I've got a bunch of different consent stories that I use with people that I believe you got the handouts. But I think the way I teach it is consent is a freely chosen yes. And that freely chosen means without lies, threats, pressure, blackmail, intimidation, bribes, and force. So, sort of examples of what is considered not freely chosen. And then I'm just going to skip these stories right now, but you can certainly use them and you probably use something like them. But what I'm teaching is you need 2 yeses for consent. So the first question you ask is, did the person say yes? Yes. If they did say yes, was it freely chosen? Yes. So 2 yeses is what I'm looking for. So someone could say yes, but they had just had a gun held to their head. So they'd get 1 yes, not 2, right? Because we'd say, did they say yes? Yep. Was it freely chosen? Nope. Someone held a gun to their head. So we want 2 yeses when we're teaching about consent. And I want to just open it up now for questions because we only have a few minutes left. Do you have a link for more information on the Scarborough method? I don't. The woman who designed it, her name is Winifred Kempton, so you could Google her. She was a sexuality educator. Anna just put in my website, which is elevatustraining.com. And we also have on the website a resource page with lots of articles and tips for talking and teaching and some lesson plans and things that you could go take a look at too to get, learn some more as well. And then, like I said to everyone before, I do have a curriculum that is 22 lessons and we updated it recently. So we feel like it's pretty up to date. I mean, there's always changes we can make, right? But been recently updated and talks about, it has many, many different topics, and you can go on the website and look at the table of contents and learn more about some of the parts of the curriculum. And it also comes with communication boards. And we also just designed some PowerPoint slides too, to go with the curriculum, because so many people are teaching online now. So that's available as well. But yeah, if you check out my website, there's also, we do some different trainings, webinar, online workshop kind of things that are an hour and a half, and bringing in different topics around developmental disability and sexuality. We're going to be doing one on consent in March, where an educator is going to use Forrest Gump to talk a little bit about consent, because one of the issues that comes up is, can people with disabilities consent? So how do we teach skills in being able to consent too? And we have some online courses as well, so you can check out what's available on my website too. Any last questions or thoughts or comments? Or
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Katherine. This has been really helpful. And I did have one question about the communication boards, because it's something that has been recommended to me before to use in EC or AC classrooms with students, and also to make regular curriculums more accessible in mainstream classrooms as well. And I was wondering if you had any recommendations around designing communication boards. One thing I'm wondering is, do I need to use specific types of photos? Like, for example, the photos from the pictures from Boardmaker that are commonly used with assisted communication, or can you just use any type of images? What would be your recommendation around making a communication board for a program?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. We did do a workshop, an online workshop on this exact thing. So how can you create your own communication supports? That's available on our website as a pre-recorded one, which we have for purchase. So that might be helpful, because Molly Rarick, who created our communication boards, she's leading the workshop. This is her thing, and she's the one that created the tools for us as well. So we'll be getting some really good ideas around how to do that. From designing the communication boards, we learned that actually the best graphics are real photos. That's, sort of best one. But they're really hard when you have a board with so many small graphics. So we went more towards kind of icons and more illustrations than regular photos. So that was kind of the next best thing. And in our curriculum, we have a lot of photos that we use for teaching, but on a board, it's just hard to get so much there. So that's what we did as far as trying to meet, meet the needs of the population.